Yo, it's Tug from We Make Best, and in this video I wanted to go over what I think is the most important tips to actually improving at Flesh and Blood. So let's get straight into it. So for tip number one, we have understanding your spot. I think it's safe to say everyone's been in a game where you're just stuck blocking out with your whole hand every single turn until you eventually die. Well, what if I told you that we can stop this from ever happening to you again if we learn about understanding your spot? So to explain what your spot actually is, if you watched my last Why You Sucked video, then you might remember this equation that I had in there, which was your game plan plus context of the game equals how to find the right play. And so the game plan plus context part is what I've actually started to call your spot for short. So the number one most important thing you need to be able to understand your spot is you need a basic game plan. Now this game plan doesn't have to be perfect to begin with, since we can always improve it over time. But what is important is that you just have one. This is because we need to be able to reference the game state, aka the context of the game, with our game plan to be able to start understanding our spots. So to show it an example, let's take a random game plan and try to apply this equation to figure out the spot. So let's just say you're an Icelander and step one of your game plan is you need to land an aura nice and early to win the match. And then say we're in game and we do exactly that. We find the aura, slam that shit, turn 0, booyah. Here we can reference the game plan and the context of the game. So in the context of the game is we did it so early that the opponent hasn't been able to do anything to us yet, which is a good thing. So that means we're in a good spot, right? And now we can say in a different game, say we have the exact same game plan, but this time we don't see the aura early. Instead, the opponent leaks a lot of damage on us, is able to disrupt us a bit, and all of that jazz before we actually find the aura. Then we get it out finally, but here we've actually lost a bit of life and the opponent's actually in control of the game. So same game plan has been achieved, we found the aura, but when we compare the context of the game to each other, in the first one we still have full life and the opponent hasn't done anything, whereas in this context the opponent has chunked us and they've got the tempo before we actually achieved our game plan. So with the first one we were in a good spot. When compared, we can easily say that this would be a bad spot, and that's all we want the game plan for, just to be able to reference it towards the current game state and what a good spot looks like as opposed to what a bad spot looks like for our game plan. And so that's just the basics of it. So let's go a little bit more in depth now. So now we have a game plan and we know how to use this equation in order to find what type of spot we're in. Now let's go over how we use this to figure out the correct play. And it's actually pretty simple from here. So say we're in a good spot, what would the correct play be? Well, it would be to not make any risky plays. This is because if we're in a good spot and the game continues playing out in the same fashion, you will inevitably win. A handy way to see it is, think of it that you and your opponent are in a race, and since you're in a good spot, you're slightly in the lead of them. So all you have to do is just make sure you don't fall over and then you win. But now let's flip this upside down and say that in the same example, since you're in the good spot, your opponent will be in a bad spot. And what that means for them is if the game continues like this, they'll inevitably lose. So then what is the right play when you're in a bad spot then? Well, since they're gonna lose anyway, they need to make that risky play in order to get into a better spot or even win. Something like taking a hit from a snatch and hoping that they draw bad, or rolling scabs and just risking losing your entire turn. All these high risk, high reward plays like this. And the main reason you want to do this is because since you're going to lose the game anyway, you're not actually risking the game by going for these plays, which means there is zero downside for going for these plays. Whereas if the player in the good spot goes for these plays and then it backfires, they might just lose the game because of it, even though they were inevitably going to win if they didn't go for those risky plays. So to sum it up a little bit more simple, think of it like if you're in a good spot, just hold the lead. But if you're a bad spot, make that desperation play. And this small thing is exactly what locks you in those situations that I explained at the start of this tip, since the player in the bad spot often doesn't realize they're in a bad spot early enough, or just didn't know what the correct play is from that spot. So in summary of the whole tip, create a game plan, reference that plan to the game state, so you always know what spot you're in. Then once you know if you're in a good spot, don't do anything risky, or if you're in a bad spot, flip that shit, baby. And that's understanding your spot. But now on to the next tip, we have reviewing your own games. So for anyone seriously trying to improve at Flesh and Blood, this is by far the best way to do exactly that. Just to name a few things that recording and reviewing your own games lets you do. Lets you identify your mistakes, adjust your game plans, improve decision making, learn from successes, identify bad habits, track your progress, and the list goes on and on and on. I seriously cannot express just how OP it is to review your own games. So let's go over exactly how to review your VODs. So VOD reviewing can be pretty hard to do at first, but my biggest tip I give to people that I've coached is focus on fixing your early mistakes. So this is because of a concept that I mentioned in my previous video of compounding mistakes. What this means roughly is it's usually the first mistake you make in a game. More often than not, that mistake is the reason for you being forced into your second mistake, and then your third mistake, then your fourth mistake, then your fifth mistake, and then you'll just lose. So with compounding mistakes in mind, if we focus on fixing that early game mistake, this will in turn fix all of the future mistakes that you would have been forced to make that game. Meaning we can fix like 10 to 20 mistakes just by fixing one mistake early. So now that we know that we want to fix our early mistakes, how exactly would I go about identifying these mistakes in my reviews? Well, like the previous tip, we just want to reference it to our game plan. And how this looks is, when watching back our VOD, we have to ask ourselves on every single decision we made, did this make sense to do in reference to my game plan? And how this can look in your game is, say your plan is to disrupt them early, but instead of playing your disruption card early, you instead attacked with the rest of your hand because you'll be able to deal double the damage. And then say in this situation, you get instantly punished because now your opponent doesn't have to block or whatever, get to keep a 6-card hand, Rain Razor, 3 of a kind, fucking all that bullshit. And then you blame Lexi for high rolling you. So this is the trap that I don't want you guys to fall into, because there's often the small things like this in game that make sense, because of course I want to swing for 12 instead of swing for 6. But since it doesn't actually make sense with your game plan, these are the decisions that are mistakes because they open you up to being punished. So biggest tip is you always have to take responsibility for everything that went wrong in the game until you prove it deeply to yourself that it isn't your fault. Having this mentality will save you from getting in your own way, and it'll really speed up the learning process for yourself. And then lastly, once you start getting into the groove of reviewing your own games, you'll soon realize that you can actually influence every single thing, every single turn, in every single game. That's because in Flesh and Blood, you draw 4 new cards every single turn that each can do 3 different things. That means there is up to 81 different ways to play every single hand you draw every turn without including equipment and hero abilities. So there is always a different way you can play it. And so in summary, start reviewing your own VODs. It's honestly a cheat code. And if you ever need help in learning how to review your VODs, I do offer coaching over on my Patreon. I even have a free coaching VOD here on YouTube that you can also try and use to learn for yourself. I'll leave a link to that on the video here. But that's it for tip number 2, review your own games. And finally, on to the last tip, we have play other decks. So have you ever felt like your opponent just knows exactly what you're going to do before you even do it, and then they always have the perfect counter to it? Well, what if I told you that's because that player has probably either subconsciously or consciously incorporated this exact tip? So let's get into play other decks. So to start it off, the funny thing is, if you watch my previous video, you will know that the first tip on that video was that you play too many decks. So let me explain. I do still believe that everyone should only have one main deck, and that's because this is what allows you to actually learn the fundamentals of the game, which sounds backwards because usually in things like sports and music, things of that nature, you want to learn the fundamentals first and build off of that. But for Flesh and Blood, it's actually the opposite. You want to develop a mastery over a single hero first, because once you develop that intuition and that muscle memory on that hero, this is what's going to let you play the game without having to think about yourself. And what this does is it kind of lets you zoom out when you're in a game and look at the game more holistically. Doing this will let you focus your attention on the game fundamentals instead of focusing on which card you have to play from your hand and when, because you will just know those things from the intuition. So yeah, main one deck, but let's get into how you should play other decks. So the key thing with this tip is we want to play other decks with the intention of learning specific things. These things can include play patterns, block order, which card is strong for which matchup, which card is weak for that matchup, etc, etc. And so when we play these other decks with the intention of learning these specific things, we actually gain insanely valuable insights onto how to play into this specific deck that we're testing out for ourselves right now. So some of the key things I personally pay attention to when I'm trying other decks is what is the play order of specific hands, which cards do I pitch when I want to play a specific card or when I want to arsenal a different card, what do I often block with first, what do I block with last out of my hand. Mainly things that you would only know when you're playing the deck and can see what's in your hand. And so we focus on these things so that when we verse this specific deck with our main hero, we can almost fully predict our opponent's hand as soon as they block or pitch with one card. But like I said, this is only made possible if we play these other decks with the intention of feeling out and learning these play patterns. Then once you learn and apply this tip to your own games, it'll make your opponent feel like they're playing with their hand shown to you every single turn. So very underrated tip. And so that's it for play other decks. But if you enjoyed this type of video, please tell us in the comments below, because these are honestly my favorite types of videos to make. And if you do like this type of content, I'd also recommend checking out our Patreon, as I do really in-depth stuff like that with my main deck Kano over in there. But that's it for the video, and I'm out.